Support for Lab Out Loud is provided by NSTA, the National Science Teaching Association. Find out more about what NSTA has to offer at nsta.org. You're listening to the Lab Out Loud podcast, Science for the Classroom and Beyond. And in today's show, we're talking about diseases.
So one of the reasons why studying baboons is really interesting, especially for the disease side that I'm looking at, is because they carry these diseases and these parasites that humans can get. So they make a really nice, what we would call like a model species. And so then we can start looking at what's likely to make an individual at risk of getting a disease. So it should help us inform conservation practices and things like that.
That's up next on Lab Out Loud, but first, I'm your co-host, Dale Basler.
And I'm Brian Bartel.
Oh man, this episode, if you're looking at like keyword searches for podcast episodes, today's episode's got a couple hot topics that have been in the news. This show's going to talk about Parasites. You know, Parasite the movie won the best.
Oh, yeah?
I
wasn't even going there.
Not the same, but it still works. We're going to talk about diseases. I don't know if you've heard, but there's this COVID-19 virus all over the place. Well, not all over the place. But, you know, this is a perfect example when you talk to people and they say, why are they spending money on this or this or this? You know, some weird study where they're testing elephants and how they digest things and stuff like that. Why are they wasting money on that? Well, you know what? Sometimes that basic research is so necessary to get a big picture of how the world works, because then you have that info in your pocket when you need it, when a big virus comes around, things like that.
And can be applied to other things when we rely on them.
Heck yeah. So this is one of the another one of the scientists in...
Well, wait. We haven't checked all our boxes yet. We're going to talk about poop as well.
Where is poop in the news?
No, we're just going to talk about poop.
Oh, you're just saying that poop is as far as search engine optimization.
Sorry, actually, yes,
but
it's in the tag. I put it in the tags. Actually, I actually did poo. That's more British sounding since our guest is from across the pond.
For sure. Well, tell us about our guest.
Her name is Cassandra Raby. And, she's actually, it's interesting because this is part of our Scientist Out Loud series. And she was doing some active research until just recently. She's taken a slight career path change at the moment, but, she still is going to tell us a lot about what her research was and what she's interested in doing still. And, some of the more memorable parts of that research, which does include collecting samples of poo.
So a lot of my research involves poo, and when I'm actually doing data collection, it's not unlikely that I'll end up with actual poo on me, which just sounds awful now I'm saying it out loud. But it's such an important part of finding out more about the diseases that these baboons have that I've become quite attached to it. So in the field, the baboons, when they're pooing, all the parasite eggs come out with that. So I can collect a small sample, and then I can have a look down the microscope and I can see who's got a lot of parasites and who doesn't have a lot of parasites and which parasites they actually have. So I spend a lot of time in the lab working with the feces.
This is the first time we've actually had someone on the show who has been into feces, and that we know of. Maybe there's been some research in the past that we don't know about. But how does one collect baboon feces?
Well, so being able to see,
Carefully.
you have to know who the individual is. Yeah, you have to know who it is that's pooing, because we want to be able to know how that information in the poo relates to the individual and everything to do with them. So we see a baboon pooing and we wait until they move away from the feces, and then we go and we just take a small sample, kind of like the size of a bean or a pea, and we put that into a tube of formaldehyde. And the formaldehyde is really good at preserving things. So it will kill all the parasite eggs, but it will keep them looking exactly the same as what they looked at before. And then once I've collected those samples, I bring them back to the UK and I sieve the poo to take out any of the large lumps. And then I do some other processing with it. So I mix it up with some other chemicals to try and take out all the fecal matter that I'm not interested in. And I'm just left with a pellet of all the eggs that are in the feces. And then I look down the microscope and I just identify them and count the numbers that are there.
We've had some discussions about work-life balance recently. This is definitely not some work that you want to take home with you, right?
You want to try not to for a number of reasons. But sometimes, you're taking stuff through the airport and you're not going straight to the lab straight away. So sometimes.
Yeah, do you have
I never even thought about that. You got to carry the samples through the airport.
Clear customs.
You've got to have all the veterinary checks, and of course they want to make sure that what you're taking out of the country is what you're saying, because they want to make sure that you're not taking a really delicate part of an animal, say for ivory, for example. So they've got to check through all your samples that you've got, and I mean, this
is going to hurt you more than it's going to hurt me, right?
I always feel a little bit embarrassed, like, here's a box of poo. I'd like to take it home, please. And then you bring it through the airport. And if you're not going to the lab straight away, then it stays with you until you get it there. So, you sometimes bring your work home with you.
So what's their reaction like? Are they ever like, what's their reaction?
There is, but one of the problems we have, so one of our baboon troops, we've named them after diseases, and it's not, luckily they don't know, so they don't mind, but on the tubes we have the baboon names on there, but we've kind of forgotten that, some of them are called things like malaria or Ebola, and we've got tubes saying... And I've realized now I've got to put the scientific code of the individual on instead, because if someone takes a close look at those tubes, I could potentially end up having to really explain the situation, because
that's a separate line.
Well, that's fascinating to think about, because of course when we do science, we might have those, like, how do we do naming, and how to, what are the consequences of our decisions, and how do they affect basic, just how we do our jobs.
Yeah, and it's a fun way of bringing a bit of lightheartedness to scientific research, but sometimes there's consequences that you don't necessarily anticipate coming about from that.
Did I hear you correctly? The baboons are named after the parasites they have, or the diseases they have?
It's just general disease names. So because we have so many baboons, and we've been doing... So I'm part of a baboon project that's been studying these baboons for over 20 years now. So we've seen a lot of them come and go, either they've moved on or they've died. And so through time, we've had quite a lot of baboons, so that we need quite a lot of names. And so we just choose any kind of disease names that are easy to remember and easy to write down, because obviously you've got to write notes when you're in the field. Yeah.
These are names that you're using for your notes and things, essentially, for the study.
Just so you know who's who. Yeah. So
it's easier than like a 97259.
Yeah.
And then,
Exactly. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit and tell our listeners about baboons? Where are you going to find them? Where do they live? What do we know? What are we trying to find out about baboons?
Yeah, sure. So I study chacma baboons, and they are found in southern Africa. So I study them in Namibia, which is just northwest of South Africa, but they're also in South Africa as well, and a few other countries. But there's about 5 or 6 baboon species in total. So we've got the Hamadryas baboon, the olive baboon, the yellow baboon. I've forgotten which ones I've listed, and the ones left. Okay, I'm going to write them down.
Brian will put a full list of baboons in the show notes, right, Brian?
It'll test my binomial nomenclature skills here. For all kids listening, we definitely have to have the genus and the species italicized, and I'll let you figure out the capitalization. See if we got it right.
Yeah, so they all come down as Papio species. And they have a lot of hybridization as well. So even though we've got these separate species, there is sometimes overlap where they're interbreeding a little bit. So that makes it quite interesting as well. They're all over Africa. They live everywhere in Africa and on the Arabian Peninsula as well, so just across the water. And they generally live in pretty much every habitat type that's there. So they don't really live in very tropical forests, but where I study mine, they're living in a really arid kind of desert-like environment. So they generally can exploit quite a lot of different habitat types. And the different species, so we've got these different baboon species, they don't necessarily specialize to a different habitat type. So that can make the research really interesting in terms of looking at species differences. So I look at some of the baboon species with the biggest body size, and does that mean they get different parasites because of that? And then I can also look at the environmental differences. So if that same baboon species is living somewhere dry compared to those that are living somewhere a bit wetter. So one of the reasons why studying baboons is really interesting, especially for the disease side that I'm looking at, is because they carry these diseases and these parasites that humans can get. So they're closely related to us, so they can get some of the same diseases. But also some of the apes can get too. So we're looking and thinking about chimpanzees and gorillas and what parasites they get. So they make a really nice, what we would call like a model species in order to look at their behavior. And then we can assume that maybe some of these same patterns are seen either in humans or in gorillas. And so then we can start looking at what's likely to make an individual at risk of getting a disease. So it should help us inform conservation practices and things like that.
Cass, you've mentioned that obviously you don't live in southern Africa and in the Arabian Peninsula, and you travel to do your field work, or you have traveled in the past there. I think maybe some students might not recognize that you don't have to live where you're doing your research necessarily to be a scientist. Can you explain that a little bit?
Oh, yeah, that's a really good point. And so I've done research. I've traveled out to do the field work with the baboon troops I'm studying. So I live and I'm from the United Kingdom, and I travel out to Namibia. And I get to know that habitat really well, and it's a steep learning curve to have to learn a whole new environment, because you do want to understand the place that you're traveling to. But when I want to look and extrapolate to a wider level, when I want to look across the whole continent, then I can use other techniques. So a lot of that has been done based in the office. And for example, I use a lot of satellite data. So information that comes from satellites can tell me about what the habitat and what the weather is like across the continent. And then I can find out a little bit more about the baboon species from that. And then I can also use work that other people have done, because science is about building on knowledge. So, you don't necessarily have to go to these places in order to understand them and to appreciate them.
Okay. Can you tell us how you got interested in this field, or what led you to baboon poop? I glibly say that, but it's
mainly the smell.
Well,
sorry, I'm just here for the jokes.
So I've pretty much always been interested in animal health, and from that, I always assumed I was going to go into like veterinary medicine and have a focus on individual health. But then I realized I was also quite interested in conservation too. So I instead wanted to look at population level health. So I started with a zoology degree and just got a general overview of animal life histories and understanding animal life in nature. And I found that I was really interested in animal behavior. I'm really interested in how animal behavior influences disease spread. And so I started this interest really quite early on. And it's actually I didn't always want to work with primates necessarily, but it just so happens that primates are amazing at answering that question for me, because a lot of other animals, you can't follow their behavior very easily. So I get to follow these baboons all day. I get to watch everything to do with their life. And previously I was working on birds, and as soon as, you can collect that information on a bird, as soon as you let it go, you don't know anything that's going on. Obviously, technology has changed quite a lot now, and we've got these great radio trackers, but a lot of that's quite new, and a lot of it's quite expensive. So a nice, easy way of studying animal behavior and disease spread is to just be able to follow the animal and just see all the behavior that they're doing along the way. From that, primates just ended up being a really useful tool for that. And I got really lucky that I just so happened my supervisor had a lot of poo samples that needed analysing, and I just so happened to be really keen to analyse them. So it started off a really long-term project that we've kept going for a while now.
So then, can you explain the path then from your educational? Were you interested in this in your undergrad, and then where did you go?
Yeah, so it's not been a very linear journey so much. Although I was interested in it at my undergraduate, I didn't really know how to go about doing it as an actual job. I was really excited that, I found a topic I was interested in, but I didn't know how to take it any further. So after my zoology undergrad, I then worked in a laboratory. I did a lot of chemistry in that laboratory, and it was completely different. And then I thought, well, I'd quite like to continue studying, so I did a master's. And that's when I met my supervisor, and I started working on the baboon parasites. But we didn't have any funding to kind of keep it going or for me to do a PhD. So I took a job working on soil samples, which to me was quite a shock at this time, because
there's no poop in there.
Yeah, none. But what there is in there is small microbial amoeba and other protists in there.
Absolutely.
And I love kind of looking at microbial ecology. And I didn't realize this until I kind of took that job, and I realized that there's loads of other really exciting things that I could be doing as well. So that project was looking at how we can use peatlands. So we take a core sample, and we can use those and the animals the amoeba that are living in there to explain what previous environmental conditions were like. And then we can use that. So peatlands are really important because they hold a lot of carbon from the environment. And at the moment, a lot of peat is being burnt or it's being degraded, and that's releasing a lot of carbon in the environment. So understanding those a lot more is really important. And I got to do this from my point of view, which was looking at small things it's really similar to looking at small things in poo, but it just so happens to be small things in soil. So I did that for a little while we got funding for my PhD. And then I moved, and then I managed to do my PhD from there.
Okay. So then we've had a few scientists on the show who've talked about, just as you mentioned, it was not quite a linear path to where I ended up. Has that been your experience with other colleagues, both, near and afar, of how they got to where they are now?
Oh, I'd say it's really variable. Some people, they start on a type of research that they're interested in, and it kind of continues for a long time. And they become, they get to embrace their expertise in that area. Whereas I know a lot of people, especially after your PhD, when maybe the kind of funding you get for your PhD, there just aren't the opportunities for jobs in that area afterwards. People then feel like, okay, well, I've got these really cool research skills. How can I apply that to something else? So I know a lot of people that might have had a linear career path up until their PhD, and then afterwards thought, okay, well, I can apply this knowledge elsewhere. So it's really variable, I would say.
Sure. Yeah. It's fascinating to me to think about, again, how many people we've had talk about how they ended up in a place where they didn't think they were going to be. And, there is a lot of important discovery and personal kind of journey along the way. And I think our students probably don't recognize that. They think I might want to be a soil biologist, and actually ending up there is probably not as linear as a path as they might expect, like you said. And they're going to take different turns and discover different things and realize that this was not maybe what I wanted to do, and I ended up doing something else. And I think that's a really important message for our students as they're thinking about maybe a career or some kind of like at least a hobby in science, I guess, and thinking about it that way.
Yeah, and I think for me, looking back, I think that takes the pressure off a little bit, because you always think, well, okay, there's this one thing and I should try and do that thing. And if I don't, I take a job elsewhere or do something different, then I failed. And I think if you just realize that maybe, you can take all these other opportunities and it will still lead you where you will want to end up, then it takes the pressure off a little bit. You haven't failed, you're just taking a different path. And I think that's a nice way of looking at it.
Absolutely.
Is there something that you've learned, bringing it back to baboons, something you've learned about baboons that surprised you or would surprise us?
Oh, that's a good question. I think a lot of people, when I talk about baboons, they're always a bit surprised at how they have this association of baboons with being really aggressive, and that being quite an important part of their identity. Actually, I think the thing that I was really surprised about working with them was just how loving they are to each other and how important those social bonds are. So they spend so much of their lives grooming each other. And I had always assumed that this was very much to do with trying to remove parasites and just keep each other clean. But actually, it's such an important part of maintaining social relationships, so much more so than it is to do with anything to do with parasites. And the amount that they invest in having friendships is really interesting. And it comes at a cost as well, because, potentially that's having so much contact with individuals is going to increase their likelihood of having diseases transmitted to them. So it's really interesting to kind of see how keen they are to have these social bonds. I think that's really nice.
And sometimes they use the term baboon as like derogatory, like, like you're being oafish or like mean or something like that.
Really
like making it sound like baboons are not smart.
Yeah, I mean, out of all the primates, they're definitely not the smartest.
All right.
But that doesn't mean they don't have these complex social interactions. But they definitely need to get a bit more credit than they do at the moment, because you're right, people have this really negative association with the word baboon.
Yeah. What about the parasites? What have you learned from studying the parasites in the baboons? I'm sure tons, but what is there anything that stands out?
Part of me feels like I've learned nothing. It's one of the tricky things. You want this really important finding, but it's sometimes more complicated than that. But I would say the interesting thing for me is that the environment is so important in determining what parasites and how many parasites baboons get. And so, therefore, probably what humans and other apes get. So, for my research, I looked at loads of different ways in which influence the parasites that individuals are getting from either across the whole continent, from within the population, and then at an individual level. And each time, even when we account for, these individual variations, the most important thing that came out was the environment in dictating what parasites were there, and also how many were there. And this has got quite important consequences, really, because if we think about, the fact that the climate is changing. If the climate is going to end up being more suitable for parasite survival, or if it's going to change baboon behavior and increase parasite transmission, then we could be looking at a scenario where disease is going to be on the rise. So that was probably the interesting thing that came out of it for me.
So a lot of this is like, we're not looking for a particular discovery. We are just want to know the full story. So, we're prepared when we get new information.
Yeah.
Okay. You're also doing research in workplace diversity and inclusion. Would you like to talk about that?
Yeah. So this it's a bit of a short-term job, but it's an interesting change for me. So I've always been quite interested in thinking about making sure that things are accessible for people. And in particular, I've thought about this in terms of STEM, so all the science and mathematics subjects. We're not necessarily seeing the amount of diversity that we would like to see in these environments. So this project looks at things, it's based in the retail environment, which in the UK is quite interesting. So the retail environment hires a lot of women. The women are the main customers, but we're not necessarily seeing all the women on the CEO boards and at the top levels. And so we're kind of wanting to ask the questions why. So it's quite a new way of looking at things for me. So I am so used to using quantitative data, so numbers and statistics. And that's why I was keen to be part of the project, because I can bring those skills along. But a lot of the other people I'm working with are working on these qualitative data, which, again, with baboons, I can't ask them a question and then get that information. So to me, it's so novel. Like, you ask them how they feel.
Yeah.
You can't do perception surveys with baboons, is what you're saying.
No, they tell you nothing.
They look at you like, wait, I don't know.
Yeah.
Was that an adjustment for you then? Like switching from that quantitative, qualitative kind of?
Yeah, it's been quite a learning curve, and a nice one as well, because I'm always interested in getting these new skills. And one of the really nice things about working in science and research is to always be learning. Like, it's so exciting. So it's been quite a bit of an adjustment, but one that I'm enjoying. And it's always nice to know when you're researching something that you feel interested and passionate about as well. It really keeps you excited.
Yeah, it's interesting because Dale and I come from obviously science teaching background. We've been trained in the sciences, and one of the I guess the trends in American education right now is an increasing analysis of assessment data, and there's been a lot of, I guess, what I would call some of that qualitative assessment, or looking at some of the maybe perception data as well. And I struggle with that too, because I want, where's the hard data that we can analyze here?
Yes.
What have you learned from this, or how can you help us navigate through what we need to do?
Yeah, and before I came on this, I was very much like, well, if you're not using numbers, how do you know what's going on? But actually, I think there's a lot of value in being able to give an individual a voice. As soon as you make everything about data, you kind of, you're getting a nice big picture, but you're not necessarily looking at things on an individual level all the time. So it's nice to be able to find out, if you have extremes or anomalies in your data, why have they come about? And those individuals can give their perceptions on that. And it kind of helps you open up a few more questions as well. So, having quantitative data is hypothesis-led. So you already have the theory, you already know what you want to look for, and then you look for it. Whereas qualitative allows you to maybe be a little bit more open in what it is you actually want to ask. The people you're interviewing kind of get to lead that a little bit. So I think there's value in both. And as a conservation biologist, I know that, if I ever want to work and manage an area or think about conservation projects, I'm always going to have to include the people that live in those areas or work in those areas. And so being able to give them a voice is a really nice part of what qualitative data collection is all about.
When you go back into the field, I assume you'll probably go back to studying with the baboons. Is that going to be a trick then? I can't ask bubonic plague here what how did he eat this, or where he got this food source and whatnot. Can you take some of that information though back into the field when you actually go back into doing your standard science job?
I'll never be able to apply it to the baboons in that sense. But because if I was to start looking at human and wildlife conflict, it's a lot of people don't really enjoy living around baboons because baboons like to destroy things. So if I wanted to explore the conflict side of that a little bit more, I could start asking the people that live with baboons, what is it that frustrates them and what is their perception of what baboons are like. So, it can start integrating people into the research a little bit more.
All right. Well, before we let you go, Cass, we've usually been asking every scientist we've had on the show. You have the ear of many students and many science educators. What would you like to tell them before you leave?
So I guess if you're interested in science and research, I'd say try and be open-minded about what it is you're actually interested in. Just because you're finding something not particularly interesting right now doesn't mean you're not going to find it interesting in the future or in a different context. So even though you might have a specific thing you're interested in or you're not sure what you're interested in, keep an open mind and you'll find out what suits you.
All right.
Excellent.
Well, thank you so much for your time. This has been a great conversation, and we wish you luck in working with people and with poo.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Lab Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about some of the things discussed in this episode or previous episodes, you can find show notes at our website, laboutloud.com. If you have a guest idea or a future topic that you'd like to see on Lab Out Loud, go to our contact page and send us a message. Also, you can subscribe to Lab Out Loud on your favorite podcasting app, such as Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, or wherever you like to find podcasts. While you're there, leave us a review and rating. Your input helps others find our show. Thanks again for listening.